Under the blazing sun, the desert seemed endless, an ocean of dust and heat stretching beyond sight. The wind howled low, lifting small waves of sand that shimmered like gold. Somewhere in that vast emptiness lay a woman alone, broken and left to die. Her hands were bound, her face streaked with blood and sweat, and the cruel taste of betrayal still lingered on her lips. The vultures circled overhead, waiting. The silence of the desert was her only witness, and her heartbeat grew slower with each passing hour. She had once believed that someone would come for her. Now, even hope felt like a cruel lie, but far beyond the dunes. Cutting through the horizon, like a shadow against fire, rode an Apache warrior. His horse carried the dust of 100 miles, his eyes fixed on the fading sun. The desert was not his enemy. It was his path, his test, and his vow. He had sworn to cross it for her. Every step of his horse echoed with purpose. He carried no map, no compass, only the scent of the wind and the memory of her face. He had seen the smoke from afar, thin and dark against the sky, rising from the valley where white men had built their cabin. He knew what that smoke meant. They had come again, the traitors, the drifters, the outlaws who took what they wanted and buried what they broke. She had been among them once, a girl with soft eyes and a voice that trembled when she spoke his language. She had brought him water once when he was wounded, hiding him from soldiers who hunted his kind. That single act had bound their fates. Now, days later, the desert told him her story without words. He found the broken trail of wagon wheels, the half-buried shawl caught in a cactus, the prints of horses dragging someone who fought back. He could see where she had fallen, where she had been struck, and where they had left her. He touched the sand, closed his eyes, and whispered to the wind in Apache, asking it to carry his promise. He would find her dead or alive. The sun bled into the western sky, turning the world crimson. Coyotes began their mournful cries as the night took hold. The warrior stopped by a dry riverbed and built a small fire, feeding it with sagebrush and broken branches. The flames flickered against his face, revealing scars that spoke of old wars. He carried no fear-only purpose. Each breath he took was for her. Each mile behind him was a memory of what he had lost. In the distance, the woman stirred. Her body was weak, the ropes biting into her wrists. The pain was sharp, but it reminded her she was still alive. She tried to scream, but her voice cracked against the dry air. The men who left her there thought she would never survive the night. They thought the desert would claim her quietly the way it always did. But she had something they didn't, a promise she had once made to a man who had saved her. She had sworn she would wait for him, no matter what came. Her thoughts drifted between memory and pain. She remembered the day she met him, a wounded Apache crawling through the rocks near the river, blood staining his chest. She should have been afraid, but something in his eyes stopped her. They weren't the eyes of a killer, but of a man carrying too much sorrow. She had hidden him in her barn, fed him, cared for him, and nursed him back to life. In those quiet nights, when the crickets sang and the world felt far away, something grew between them, something forbidden. The townsfolk had whispered. They had seen her sneaking to the hills, carrying food, carrying water. They had warned her that Apaches brought death, but she hadn't listened. She had seen the way he looked at the stars, the way he spoke of freedom and the land as though it were alive. He had taught her to listen to the wind, to the fire, to the silence between. And when he left, promising to return one day, she had waited. Now she lay dying, wondering if he would ever know. The warrior rode through the night, guided by the moon. The stars above him felt close enough to touch. He stopped only once to water his horse at a shallow creek. The water was bitter, but it kept him alive. He thought of her, her voice, her kindness, the way she smiled even when she was afraid. The world had taken everything from him, his people, his land, his peace, but not her memory. That was something the desert could never bury. By dawn, the horizon glowed pale orange. The wind carried the faint cry of a bird-a-hawk circling above. He followed it, knowing that life and death often met in the same place. The air smelled of smoke and blood. He dismounted, crouching low, his eyes sharp as a blade. He saw the prints again, boots, wagon wheels, a broken rope. Then he saw her. She was tied to a dead tree, her skin pale under the morning light, her lips cracked and bleeding. He moved closer, quiet as the wind, every step careful. When her eyes opened, for a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The sun behind him turned him into a shadowy spirit out of the sand. "Is it you?" she whispered, her voice weak. He didn't answer at first. He just cut the ropes with his knife and caught her before she fell. The blade glinted in the light, but there was no anger in his eyes, only sorrow. He looked at her wounds, the blood on her neck, the bruises that marked her body. His hands trembled not from fear, but from rage buried deep. She tried to speak, but he pressed a finger to her lips, shaking his head. "Save your breath," he said softly. His voice was rough, but his tone carried a strange tenderness. He lifted her gently and carried her to the shade. She looked up at him, her vision fading. "They said you wouldn't come." He met her gaze, his jaw tightening. They were wrong. The sound of hooves broke the silence. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing toward the horizon. Dust rose again, too much to be the wind. Riders were coming back, the same men who had left her. He could see their silhouettes against the rising sun. His grip on his knife tightened. The desert wind picked up again, swirling around them like a warning. He knew what had to be done. There was no law here, only justice written in blood and sand. The woman tried to move, but he stopped her. "Stay hidden," he whispered. She touched his arm weakly. "Don't fight them. You'll die." He looked down at her, and for a moment a faint smile crossed his face. "Then I'll die standing." The first rider came into view, a man with a scar across his cheek, rifle in hand, laughing as if death itself were a joke. Behind him rode for more, their faces hard, their eyes full of greed. The Apache warrior stepped into the open, knife in one hand. The desert sun blazing behind him. The riders slowed, their laughter fading when they saw him. One of them spat into the dust. "You should have stayed dead, Indian." The warrior said nothing. The wind howled between them, carrying the weight of everything that had been lost, and then, without a word, he moved. The desert would soon remember what happened that day, but for now, the only thing certain was, this: he had crossed the desert for her, and no man was going to take her away again. The riders slowed their horses when they saw him standing in the open. Dust swirled between them, the rising sun casting long shadows across the dry land. The Apache warrior said nothing, his knife glinting faintly in the morning light. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of sweat, leather, and old gunpowder. The men laughed softly, thinking they were facing a savage with nothing but a blade. They didn't know the kind of man they had found, the kind who had crossed a desert for love, the kind who had buried too many brothers to ever fear death again. He stood his ground as they circled him slowly, boots grinding the earth. The leader, the man with the scarred cheek, spat into the dust and raised his rifle. "Looks like you came too late, Apache. We left her for the buzzards." The warrior's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. The man smirked, lowering his aim toward the woman who was still weak and half hidden behind a rock. "Guess we should finish what we started." That was the moment the Apache's silence broke. With a sound that came from deep in his chest, a cry that echoed across the plain, he moved like lightning. Before the rifle could fire, his knife flashed, slicing through air and skin alike. The scarred man dropped, clutching his throat, choking on his last breath. The others froze for an instant, shock flashing through their eyes before reaching for their guns. The fight was not yet over, but the desert held its breath. The woman turned her head weakly, watching as the warrior faced them all, alone. Her heart pounded with fear and awe. She had seen men fight before, but never like this, never with such silent fury, such precision. Each motion was born from pain and purpose, every strike a message. Yet the battle was not hers to witness. Her strength faded again, her vision darkening, the world spinning into quiet. The last thing she saw was the warrior standing tall against the dawn, a lone shadow between her and the men who had left her to die. By the time she opened her eyes again, the sun was high, and the world had fallen into stillness. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. The warrior knelt beside her, his face streaked with dust, his hands gentle as he poured water over her lips. The taste brought her back from the edge. She coughed weakly, her voice trembling. "Are they gone?" He nodded, his voice low. "They won't come back." Her eyes filled with tears, though she didn't know if they were from pain or relief. "You shouldn't have come for me," she whispered. He looked away, his expression unreadable. "I gave my word." The words carried a weight that went beyond the moment. In that promise was the story of everything that had come before the river where they had first met. The village that had burned, the soldiers who had hunted him, and the nights they had shared. Whispering to each other in broken words between two worlds, he lifted her gently and carried her to his horse. The sun beat down on them, but he moved steadily, knowing the desert allowed no weakness. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breath shallow. Every few minutes he would glance down to make sure she still breathed. The land around them stretched endless and cruel, but he had learned its language. He could read its signs, the color of the sand, the flight of the vultures, the whisper of the wind through the sage. The desert was alive, and it would guide him. They rode through the day until the sky turned orange again. When night came, he stopped near a canyon where an old stream had once flowed. He built a small fire, careful to shield its light with stones. She lay wrapped in his blanket, her face pale but calmer now. He sat nearby, sharpening his knife quietly. The firelight flickered against his features, showing both youth and the burden of too many battles. After a while, her voice broke the silence. "Why did you come back?" He didn't look at her at first. "Because I couldn't forget you." She studied him in the glow, her heart tightening. "After what they did to your people, you should have hated mine." He finally met her eyes, and his gaze softened. "Hate burns everything it touches. I've burned enough." She turned her face toward the fire, remembering the night the soldiers came. They had accused her of helping him, called her a traitor, taken everything she had left. She had watched them ride away, leaving her in the dirt, thinking the desert would finish what they started. But the desert had other plans. As the fire crackled, he spoke again, his voice quiet but steady. "When I left you by the river, I swore I'd come back when the wars were done. But the wars never ended. They only changed names." She nodded weakly. "They always do." The night deepened, the stars spreading across the sky like scattered ashes. Coyotes called in the distance, and the wind shifted, carrying a colder scent. The warrior's senses sharpened instantly. He rose to his feet and moved silently to the ridge, scanning the darkness. His eyes caught faint movement shadows against shadows. More riders? He counted at least 6. He returned to her quickly. "We have to move." She tried to sit up, but pain shot through her side. "I can't ride fast." He steadied her, helping her onto the horse. "Then we ride quiet." They slipped into the canyon, following the moonlight through the narrow pass. The sound of distant hooves echoed faintly behind them. Whoever those riders were, they weren't done hunting. Maybe it was more the same gang. Maybe it was soldiers sent to finish a different kind of job. Either way, the desert had turned against them now. They moved until the night began to fade. When the first hint of light appeared, they reached a hidden hollow beneath red cliffs. There, he finally stopped, letting her rest while he covered the tracks behind them. When he returned, she was watching him, her eyes soft with gratitude. "You saved me again." He knelt beside her, shaking his head. "You saved me first." Her lips curved faintly, but the sadness never left her gaze. "The world doesn't want us together," she said quietly. He looked toward the horizon. "The world doesn't get to decide." In the stillness that followed, the weight of their shared past hung between them. She had been the daughter of settlers, raised on warnings about the wild tribes. He had been raised to hate the white man's greed. Yet somehow, through all the hate, they had found something human, something fragile. He reached into his pouch and took out a small charma-carved stone shaped like a bird. "My mother gave me this," he said. "She said it keeps spirits close. I thought I'd lost it, but I found it again the night before I left for you." She touched it gently, her fingers trembling. "Then maybe it brought you back." He smiled faintly. Or maybe you did. The peace between them was brief. In the distance, the cry of a hawk broke the silence, sharp and warning. The warrior's head lifted instantly. He knew that sound too well. It wasn't just a birdit, it was a signal. Someone was still tracking them. He rose again, scanning the cliffs. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of campfire smoke, too close to be chance. His hand tightened around his knife. The desert was full of ghosts, but these weren't the kind made of memory. He turned back to her. If they find us, I'll draw them away. Follow the canyon north. You'll find a river. Stay by it. Her eyes widened with fear. No, not again. I won't lose you twice. He hesitated, torn between duty and the ache in her voice. If I stay, they'll kill us both. Then let them, she said, her voice breaking. I'd rather die with you than live without you. He stared at her, the fire in her words cutting through the night air. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached out, brushing a hand against her cheek. You're stronger than you know, he whispered, before she could answer. The sound of horses came again, closer this time, echoing through the canyon like thunder. He stood knife in hand, the dawn beginning to glow behind him. The wind carried the smell of danger. She tried to rise, but he stopped her gently. Stay low, he said. And if I don't come back before the sun is high, keep riding. Tears welled in her eyes as she watched him step into the light, the rising sun setting fire to his long black hair. The desert wind wrapped around him, and for a moment, he looked like part of it, like the land itself had risen to protect her. He turned once more, his voice calm and sure. They left you to die, he said. Now the desert will decide who deserves to live. And with that, he walked toward the sound of hooves, leaving her in the shadow of the cliffs, praying to every god she knew. The man who had crossed the desert for her would make it back again. The sound of hooves grew louder, echoing through the canyon walls like thunder chasing lightning. The Apache warrior stood still for a moment, every muscle tense, his knife gleaming faintly in the rising sun. Dust drifted in from the canyon mouth, and soon dark shapes appeared, men on horseback, rifles slung across their shoulders. They were searching, scanning every ridge and shadow. The warrior crouched low, pressing his palm against the warm sand, feeling its pulse. The desert was his ally, and he would use every inch of it. He moved silently between the rocks, the sound of his breath steady. The men spread out, their voices carrying through the wind. She couldn't have gone far. Find her and bring the Apache alive. The colonel wants him breathing. Those words made his jaw tighten. Soldiers, not outlaws this time. The kind who came with orders, not greed. That meant she was worth more than he had thought, and they wanted her back for a reason. He scanned the horizon, counting 5 riders. They moved with precision, trained and cautious. Their boots left clear tracks, their rifles polished and ready. He recognized the insignia burned into their saddles, the same mark used by the cavalry. Unit that had burned his village years ago. The same men who had taken his brother. The memory hit him like fire, but he pushed it down. Rage wouldn't save her now. Only patience would. He waited until the nearest soldier dismounted, checking the ground for signs. The man's shadow fell over the prints he and the woman had left. The Apache moved like a whisper behind him. One quick strike with the knife, and the soldier fell without a sound. He dragged the body behind a rock and picked up the fallen rifle. The smell of gun oil and sweat filled the air. It was a weapon of steel and pride, the kind men used when they believed the land was theirs. The others heard nothing. They kept moving, splitting apart to search the canyon's bends. One of them called out, "We'll find them." The woman's too weak to run. The Indian won't get far with her. The warrior's grip tightened on the rifle. Their voices echoed with arrogance. The kind he had heard all his life from men who thought they owned the desert. From where she hid, the woman could see flashes of movement, men riding close, dust rising behind them. Her heart pounded so loud she feared they'd hear it. She pressed her back against the rock, clutching the small charm he had given her. Every sound, every gust of wind made her flinch. Her body ached, but her spirit burned with one thought. He was out there fighting for her again. She couldn't bear the thought that he might die for her twice. Memories came rushing back, sharp and heavy. The colonel who had taken her from the settlement wasn't a stranger. He was the man who had offered her protection when her father died. He had promised her food, safety, and a place to live if she obeyed. But she had learned too late that his promises came with chains. When she defied him, when she refused to reveal where the Apache had gone, he had ordered her beaten and left in the desert. To him, she was just another example to make the others obey. Now he was coming back to finish what he started. The warrior moved deeper into the canyon, staying low. He could hear the clatter of hooves above him on the ridge. He lifted his rifle, taking aim at one of the soldiers silhouetted against the morning light. But then he stopped. Killing them here would bring more. He needed to draw them away from her. So he fired once not at the man, but into the air. The shot echoed across the cliffs like thunder. Immediately, the riders turned and charged toward the sound. He ran, his footsteps light, weaving between boulders, the rifle slung across his shoulder. Bullets struck the rocks around him, sending sparks and dust into the air. The sound of metal and stone mixed with the cries of men urging their horses forward. He knew this land better than any of them. He led them toward the dry ravine that opened into a maze of cliffs. There the sun hit hard, and the air shimmered like fire. It was a place where only the wise survived. Behind him, the soldiers split up again. Two dismounted, following on foot. One of them shouted orders, short, angry words. The warrior crouched behind a ledge, breathing quietly. When the first man appeared, he struck, pulling him down and silencing him before the others noticed. The rifle clattered to the ground. He picked it up, knowing he would need it soon. Further back, one of the riders stopped and raised his binoculars. "He's alone," the man muttered. "But the girl must be near." The colonel's voice answered through gritted teeth. "Bring her to me, alive. The savage will come crawling once she's in my hands again." At those words, the warrior felt something stir inside him, a cold fury that had slept too long. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every woman, every child, every elder his people had lost to men like this. But vengeance could wait. She needed to live first. He circled back through the canyon, silent as a shadow. When he reached the hollow, she was still there, trembling but alive. Her eyes widened when she saw the blood on his arm. "You're hurt," she whispered. He shook his head. "It's not mine." She reached for his hand. "You can't keep fighting them forever." He looked toward the horizon where dust clouds still rose. "Then we'll stop running." "Where?" she asked. "South," he said. "To the mountains. There's an old mission they're abandoned long ago. No one will follow us that far." She wanted to believe him, but fear lingered in her voice. "He'll come. He always does. He'll find nothing but ghosts," the warrior said. They mounted the horse again, moving swiftly through the canyon's winding paths. The sun was higher now, burning their backs. The land seemed endless, but he knew the way. Each turn, each ridge told a story, places where his people had hunted, fought, and died. As they rode, she began to see a tooth of beauty beneath the harshness. The life in the silence. By midday, they reached the edge of the canyon. Below lay a valley dotted with dry grass and twisted trees. Far beyond, faint shapes of mountains shimmered in the haze. It looked peaceful, but the warrior's instincts told him they weren't safe yet. He dismounted, scanning the horizon. The wind carried faint echoes, distant but real. Hooves again. The colonel was relentless. They found shelter beneath a rock arch where an old stream once carved its path. The warrior gathered what food they had: dried meat, a few berries, and water he had carried from the last spring. She ate slowly, her eyes watching him as he checked his weapons. His movements were calm, deliberate, but she could see the weight in his shoulders. After a long silence, she asked softly, "Do you ever wish you hadn't met me?" He stopped and turned to her. "If I hadn't, I'd be dead already." Her eyes shimmered. "Because of love?" He looked away, the word heavy on his tongue. "Because of hope." The wind howled through the valley, scattering the dust around them. She leaned back against the rock, closing her eyes. For a brief moment, it felt peaceful again, like the world had paused. But deep down, she knew the storm hadn't passed. Far away, the colonel rode at the head of his men, his face red from the sun and anger. He had lost too many soldiers to the Apache's traps. He didn't care about justice anymore, lead revenge. The woman had humiliated him, and the warrior had defied him. Now, both would pay. He looked out across the valley and smiled coldly. We'll burn him out. The desert will do the rest. That night, the wind changed. The air grew heavy with smoke. The woman awoke to the crackle of fire. Flames licked the edges of the valley, spreading fast through the dry grass. The warrior was already awake, his face set and calm. They're trying to smoke us out, he said. She coughed, covering her mouth. What do we do? He pointed toward the narrow ravine leading east. The wind's on our side. We'll move through the smoke. They won't see us. She hesitated only a moment before following him. The smoke stung her eyes, and every breath burned her throat, but she kept moving. The fire roared behind them, chasing them like a living thing. The warrior stayed close, his hand guiding her through the chaos. They emerged on the far side, coughing and covered in ash. The world behind them was burning, the sky glowing red. She turned, trembling. He'll burn everything to find us. The warrior looked back at the flames, his expression hard. Then we'll make sure there's nothing left for him to find. But even as he said it, the colonel's men were already spreading out along the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the firelight. They were closing in again. The night wasn't over, and the desert wasn't done testing them. In the distance, thunder rumbled not from the sky, but from guns being loaded. The next fight would come with dawn, and both of them knew it. The warrior touched her shoulder gently, meeting her frightened eyes. Whatever happens, he said quietly, you stay alive. Promise me that. She nodded through tears, clutching his hand. The wind carried the scent of smoke, sweat, and fear. The desert watched in silence, as if waiting to see which of them it would claim when the sun rose again. The night air was thick with smoke and dust, and the sky glowed a deep red from the fire still crawling across the desert floor. The Apache warrior stood at the mouth of the ravine, his eyes fixed on the ridge where the soldiers had gathered. The firelight flickered against their shapes, stark riders moving with purpose, rifles glinting in their hands. The colonel was there too, sitting tall on his horse, a man driven not by justice but by pride. The warrior knew men like him. He'd fought them before. They came with flags and law books, but underneath, they carried the same hunger to own what they did not understand. Behind him, the woman leaned against the rock, her breathing ragged but steady. The smoke had turned her face pale, her lips cracked from the heat. Still, she refused to rest. They'll find us before sunrise, she whispered. You can't fight them all. He turned slightly, his voice calm and sure. I'm not running anymore. She reached out, her hand trembling. If you stay, they'll kill you. Then they'll kill me too. He met her eyes, and for a moment something softened in him. Then they'll have to bleed for every step they take. The desert wind howled between the rocks, carrying the scent of burning grass. It was as if the land itself had turned into a battlefield alive, restless, waiting. He knelt and drew shapes in the dust, marking where the ravine curved and where the soldiers would come through. The ground was dry, but the canyon walls could work in his favor. He had seen floods carve these paths before. Now he would use them to carve a trap. The woman watched him silently, trying to understand the calm that lived inside his rage. You fought too many battles alone, she said softly. You don't always have to. He looked at her for a long time before answering. This isn't about battle anymore. It's about remembering who we are. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but the truth in his tone silenced her. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared toward the horizon. Where the flames faded into the night, by dawn, the fire had died down, leaving the land covered in ash and smoke. The sky was pale, the kind of light that makes everything look ghostly. The warrior stood watch at the ridge, the wind tugging at his hair. In the distance, he could see movement riders spreading out again, scanning for tracks. They were careful now, slower, knowing he was near. The colonel's voice carried faintly through the still air, shouting orders, curses, threats. The warrior climbed higher, finding a narrow ledge above the canyon. From there, he could see the whole valley, the burnt grass, the winding paths, the small trails that would confuse anyone unfamiliar with the land. He could also see the woman below, sitting by the horse, her head bowed in exhaustion. The sight of her filled him with something he didn't know how to name, a fierce, aching need to protect her. To give her the life the desert had always denied them both. A sound broke the stillness, the sharp crack of a rifle. He dropped low behind the rock. A bullet struck near his shoulder, sending chips of stone flying. Another followed, then another. They had spotted him. The colonel's men were firing from the ridge. The warrior rolled to his feet, moving fast, vanishing into the rocks before they could take proper aim. He ran along the canyon wall, his boots silent on the sand. The soldiers shouted below, their voices echoing off the stone. They were splitting up again, trying to trap him. He waited behind a boulder until one of them came close enough, then moved. The man never saw the blade, until it was too late. The warrior pulled the body aside and took the man's rifle, checking the rounds. The weapon was heavy, cold, and familiar. Down below, the woman heard the shots and covered her ears. She could see shadows moving along the ridge, too many to count. Panic pressed against her chest, but she forced herself to breathe. He had told her to trust the land, to listen instead of fear, so she did. The sound of footsteps behind her made her spin, but it wasn't him. A soldier stood there, rifle aimed at her. "Don't move," the man ordered, stepping closer. His face was smeared with dust, his eyes sharp. "Where is he?" She said nothing. Her heart pounded in her throat. The soldier grabbed her arm roughly. "Talk, or I'll—" Before he could finish, a shadow dropped from above. The Apache hit the ground behind him, the knife flashing once. The soldier crumpled silently. The warrior turned to her, breathing hard. "You're safe," he said, though his voice carried the weight of too much blood. She stared at him, trembling. "How long can we keep running?" He didn't answer right away. He looked up at the ridge, where the sun was rising fast. "Until there's no one left to run from." They moved quickly through the canyon, heading toward the old mission he had spoken of. The air grew cooler as the land began to change, jagged cliffs giving way to stony plains. The horse stumbled once, weary from the long ride, but he steadied it with a soft touch. The woman leaned against him, her strength fading. Every sound behind them felt closer now, the echo of hooves, the creak of leather, the harsh shouts of men who wouldn't stop. As the sun climbed higher, the land began to shimmer with heat again. They found a shallow cave beneath a cliff and stopped to rest. The warrior listened to the wind, then turned to her. "They're still tracking us." She looked up, her eyes dull with fatigue. "How can you tell?" "The desert tells me," he said simply. "It doesn't hide men like them." She gave a weak smile. "Then maybe it'll hide us." He looked at her and almost smiled back, but something in his expression remained distant. "The desert doesn't hide anyone. It tests them." For a while they sat in silence. He cleaned his knife, his eyes always scanning the horizon. She watched him, trying to imagine the kind of life he had lived before she met him, years of fighting, losing, surviving. She wanted to ask about his past, but the words felt too heavy. So instead she said, "You could have left me there. No one would have blamed you?" He looked up from the blade. "I would have blamed myself." Her throat tightened. "Why me?" He paused, then said quietly, "Because you looked at me and didn't see an enemy." The moment hung between them like a fragile thread. Then, from far off, the sharp cry of a hawk split the air. He stiffened immediately. "They've found us," he said. Before she could stand, he grabbed his rifle and moved to the edge of the cave. Dust was rising again, riders approaching fast. The colonel was leading them, his face hard as stone. The glint of sunlight off their rifles flashed across the valley. The warrior turned to her, his voice urgent but steady. "Ride to the mission. Follow the canyon until you see the bell tower. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" she asked, panic in her voice. "I'll hold them here." She shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "No, I won't leave you." He stepped close, his hand on her face. You have to. You're the only thing they want alive." Before she could argue, he lifted her onto the horse and struck its flank. The animal leaped forward, carrying her down the narrow trail. She looked back once, seeing him standing there alone against the wind, rifle in hand. The sight broke something inside her, but she kept going, the world blurring around her. Back at the cave, the warrior took his position among the rocks. The colonel's men spread out below, their horses snorting, their eyes scanning the cliffs. The colonel raised his hand, shouting, "He's cornered. No one leaves this canyon alive." The first shots rang out, shattering the stillness. Bullets tore into the rocks near him, sending shards flying. He returned fire, the sound echoing across the valley. The fight began in full force. Each shot was answered by another, dust and smoke filling the air. He moved like the wind, never staying still, using the land to his advantage. But there were too many of them, and the circle was closing, down the trail. The woman rode hard, tears cutting through the ash on her face. The canyon narrowed, forcing her to slow. She could still hear the distant gunfire, every shot a knife in her chest. When she reached the edge of the valley, she saw the old mission rising like a ghost from the sand, its bell tower cracked but still standing. She dismounted and ran inside, calling his name. But only silence answered. The wind outside carried the echoes of Wartha sound of a man who refused to die quietly, the sound of vengeance written in the dust. She fell to her knees, gripping the charm he had given her, whispering prayers she barely remembered. Back in the canyon, the smoke thickened. The colonel shouted orders, furious that one man was holding his entire force at bay. The warrior crouched behind a fallen rock, bleeding from his arm, his breath shallow. He knew he couldn't hold out much longer. The world around him swayed, but his focus stayed sharp. The sound of boots crunching on gravel grew closer. He tightened his grip on the rifle, eyes fixed on the ridge above. The colonel was coming himself now, determined to end it. The warrior waited, heart pounding, every sense alive. The desert wind stilled as if holding its breath. The final moment was near. The fight, the chase. The years of pain, all of it, was leading to this single instant where one man's fate would decide everything. And as the colonel's shadow fell across the rocks, the Apache warrior rose slowly from the dust. Ready to face the storm one last time, the colonel's boots crunched over the gravel as he stepped into the narrow canyon. His rifle raised, eyes sharp and full of hate. The smoke curled around the rocks like breath from the desert itself. And the morning light broke through in thin streaks, painting everything in gold and dust. The Apache warrior stood in the open now, his rifle gone, his knife gripped tight in one hand. His chest rose and fell slowly, his eyes never leaving the man who had chased him across half the desert. "So this is how it ends," the colonel sneered. "A savage cornered in his own land." The warrior said nothing. He took one step forward, then another. The colonel aimed his rifle, the barrel glinting, but before he could fire, the wind howled and a gust of sand swept through the canyon, blinding him. The shot went wide, echoing uselessly off the stone. The warrior moved fast, closing the distance between them, his knife flashing once in the harsh light. The rifle fell, clattering against the rocks. The two men struggled, their bodies crashing into the dirt. Each strike, driven by years of rage and loss. The colonel was strong, trained, but the desert favored the one who knew its rhythm. The Apache fought like the land itself, enduring, patient, waiting for the right moment. When it came, he struck clean and true. The colonel fell to his knees, shock flooding his face. The warrior caught him before he hit the ground. Lowering him gently, the man's voice was faint, his pride breaking with each word. "You think you've won? You can't stop what's coming. The land will never be yours again." The warrior's eyes softened, though his expression stayed hard. It was never mine to own, only to protect. He stood and stepped back as the colonel's eyes dimmed and the desert took him. For a long time, the warrior didn't move. The wind grew quieter, carrying away the smell of smoke and blood. Above him, the sky was clear again, as if the storm had passed. The battle was over, but peace didn't come easily. It never did. He wiped the blood from his knife and looked down the trail where faint hoofprints led away toward the mountains. She was out there safe, he hoped. That thought gave him strength. He gathered what little water and ammunition he could find from the fallen soldiers, then began the slow walk through the valley. Each step hurt, but his will was stronger than the pain. By the time he reached the open desert, the sun was high. Heat waves rippled across the sand, and every breath burned his lungs. Yet he kept walking, guided by the faint tracks her horse had left. He followed them until the land began to rise again, the air cooler, the scent of sage and stone filling his lungs. When he finally saw the outline of the old mission, his knees almost gave way. The bell tower stood crooked but proud, its shadow long across the sand. Smoke still lingered faintly in the sky behind him, a reminder of the fight he had left behind. At the mission's doorway she appeared, her face pale, but her eyes alive. When she saw him, she ran forward, her steps uneven. Tears already falling. He barely had time to open his arms before she reached him. They stood together in silence, holding on to each other like the world might vanish if they let go. His body was shaking, blood seeping through his torn shirt. But he smiled faintly when she touched his face. "I thought you were gone," she whispered. "I told you I'd find you," he said softly. "Even if the desert tried to stop me." She pressed her forehead to his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "You saved me again." He shook his head weakly. "No, you saved me first." They stayed there until the sun dipped low, turning the world golden once more. The mission around them was old, crumbling, but it felt like a sanctuary, a place forgotten by war and greed. Inside, the stone walls were cool and quiet. He lay down on the floor, exhausted, while she cleaned his wounds with water from a cracked basin. Her hands trembled, but her touch was gentle. "Rest," she said. "You're safe now." His eyes closed slowly, but his voice came faintly. "Safe isn't a place. It's a person." She looked at him then, and tears filled her eyes again. She knew what he meant. Safety wasn't about walls or soldiers. It was about the bond that had brought him across the desert, through fire and blood, just to keep a promise. Days passed quietly. The sound of the wind through the bell tower became their only companion. The horse grazed nearby, and the desert began to heal from the flames. He grew stronger each day, though the scars stayed deep. She gathered food where she could, and at night they sat by a small fire, speaking softly about the past, the village he had lost, the home she had once dreamed of building, and the strange path that had led them to each other. Sometimes she would wake in the middle of the night and find him standing outside, staring at the horizon. When she asked what he was thinking, he always said the same thing: "That peace feels different out here. It doesn't last long, but when it comes, it's worth everything." One evening, as the sun sank behind the red hills, she asked, "What will we do now?" He thought for a moment before answering. "We live. The world won't stop chasing us, but we can stop running." She nodded slowly. "Then we stay here." He smiled faintly. "For as long as the land allows it." Together they rebuilt what little they could of the mission. Patched the roof, gathered wood, cleared the old altar. It became more than shelter. It became a place of memory, of survival, of quiet defiance. The locals who sometimes passed through the valley began to speak of a woman and an Apache who lived in the ruins, who helped travelers lost in the desert. They said the man never spoke much, but when he did, his words carried the weight of truth. Seasons began to change. Rain fell for the first time in months, soft and cleansing. The dry riverbeds filled again, and the air smelled of earth and life. Flowers bloomed across the sand, their colors vivid against the dust. The woman smiled when she saw them, whispering, "Maybe the desert remembers kindness after all." He watched her quietly, the corners of his mouth lifting. "It remembers everything." Years later, when people told stories around campfires, they spoke of a woman left to die who was saved by a man who crossed the desert for her. They said he came like a shadow through fire and storm, guided by something greater than survival. Some called it love, others called it destiny. But those who truly understood said it was faith, a kind that doesn't need words, only action. One night, as the stars filled the sky brighter than ever before, he stood outside the mission again. The wind brushed through the grass, whispering softly in the dark. She came up beside him, wrapping her shawl around his shoulders. "Do you ever miss your home?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the open land stretching endlessly before them. "This is home," he said quietly. They stood there together, watching the horizon fade into silver light. For once there was no chase, no fear. Only the steady rhythm of the wind and the faint ringing of the old bell swaying in the tower. The desert had taken so much from them, but it had also given them something back, a reason to stay, to rebuild, to believe again. When dawn came, the first rays of sun spilled over the mountains, painting the land gold once more. He turned to her, his hand finding hers. "You were the one thing the world couldn't take," he said. She smiled, her eyes glistening. "And you were the one who came back when no one else would?" The desert stretched silent and endless around them, but in that quiet, there was peace, the kind that comes not from victory, but from survival, from choosing to keep walking even when the road burns beneath your feet. The land had tested them both, and they had endured. And somewhere out there, where the wind carried whispers through the canyons, the story of the warrior and the woman became part of the land itself, a reminder that even in the harshest places, love and courage could still take root, growing quietly in the sand long after the world had forgotten their names.